Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Doucette, and today I'm going to be speaking to you about translating lived experiences and why I think this matters. So first, I'd like to start off by acknowledging that I'm speaking today from Vancouver, Canada, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. And now bear with me for a second while I share my screen. Easier said than done. Okay. So first, I'd like to start off by introducing myself a bit more. So I'm a mineral engineering grad, but after I graduated, I didn't last too long as a mining engineer before I switched into podcasting and writing primarily for the geosciences. I've created two podcast series. One is called DYNOmine, and the other one is Discovery to Recovery, which was done in partnership with the Society of Economic Geologists and Sequent. So I'd like to talk to you about the first podcast series I made, which is kind of where it all began for me. But first, I'll tell you a story about myself. So that's me at my first job. I was hired in second year university to go away for the summer and work as a ventilation technician up in a mine in Northern Ontario. And I was really excited. It was a big opportunity for me, and it was going to be my first real mining job. And, I was leaving the big city of Toronto to move to a town of 5,000 people. I do have to say that excitement fizzled out pretty quickly once I actually started my role. I, was one of the only women underground. And at the time, I was just sort of coming out and letting people know that I was queer. And there was no queer community at the town I was living at, and definitely not at the mine site I was working at. So I felt really alone. I felt like I didn't really belong in the industry, keeping in mind this is my first exposure, and I just very viscerally felt that there wasn't really a place for me in it. I actually ended up quitting that job just after 2 months because my mental health had deteriorated so significantly and I didn't feel like I could stay anymore. And, when I got back to university, there were a lot of rumors being spread that I just didn't like the manual labor kind of stuff like that. And I was really too ashamed and embarrassed to correct people at the time, but I'm not anymore. So here I am. And, the thing is that we all have stories. And for better or for worse, these stories make up our life and they make up our experiences and they make up who we are. And so as a woman who had very briefly been in geoscience and then kind of left into the communication sphere, I, was meeting a lot of people, geologists, mining engineers, et cetera. And from women in particular, I just kept hearing these stories over and over again that culminated in them basically leaving the industry entirely. And it made me really sad because we were losing so much talent within mining. And so I kind of wondered to myself, is there anything I can do to sort of turn the dial a little bit? I kind of took the skills I had at the time, which really was just talking to people and working in communications. And I decided to make a podcast series called DYNOmine, which is stories about the mining industry for the mining industry. And so the first episode was composed of stories from women who had worked in the mining industry and who had felt that their gender had affected how they were treated or how their career had turned out. And the second episode I did was the experiences of queer people in the mining industry and how it had affected them. I would like to point out in the first episode, I spoke to about 5 or 6 women, and about half of them decided to remain anonymous for the podcast, which I do feel speaks volumes. We have to cultivate an atmosphere in geoscience where people can feel confident that speaking out, about the things they're facing is not going to label them as a difficult person to work with and is not going to affect their career aspirations in the future. I myself, when I left that first role, I was too scared to say anything because I was worried that no one would hire me after if, they kind of knew how I felt. So I wanted to share some of the stories from the series today. I'm actually going to play you some audio clips. And so first up is Anne, who's actually in the audience today. Hi, and she's a friend of mine now. We met through this process actually of creating a podcast, and I found her because she had written an article called Why I, a Woman, Left the Mining Industry on LinkedIn. So it's a great read. I would highly recommend it to anyone who's listening. And so one of her stories on the podcast that she talks about is when she was working in a remote exploration camp. She had gone down to take a shower during the day in the men's dry, which was empty because mostly everyone was out drilling, and it just wasn't anything out of the normal, but this is what happened.
I remember as I walked in and like had my towel and everything, so it was pretty obvious I was going to have a shower. I noticed that one of the night drillers was awake in the kitchen, and he was sitting at a table where he could see me kind of walk to the showers, and then had my shower, was finishing drying up, and I just remember hearing rustling outside the stall. And I was just very confused and kind of put it together that the driller probably was right outside my shower because I could hear this noise pretty close and it's pretty quiet otherwise. And already again just felt pretty claustrophobic, just very uncomfortable. And I just left the shower as quickly as I could with my head like buried in my gear and just didn't say anything to him. I didn't even want to look at him or look up, but I saw him anyways. And so he had moved from the kitchen to like 2 feet outside my shower.
And here's a story from Madeline, who also worked at remote exploration camps. She had just started her first job and she was in the cafeteria with her new supervisor.
My supervisor sits across from me and doesn't ask me about my past work experience or anything like that. Asks me what my relationship status is because just many people in camp apparently have been asking him about that. And I was honest and said that I was single, even though the question seemed very inappropriate. Anyways, and from that moment on, I became part of the rumor mill, basically. And people in their stories had me hooking up with just basically everyone on site. And I got just a ton of nicknames, like the Camp Prom Queen and Arctic Barbie.
And here's a story from Bill, who's a gay man. He's now retired, but he worked as a structural geology consultant.
At one point, I was staying at a motel, and I was in the television room one evening with a couple of other guys from another crew that was staying in the motel. And the news came on, and it was announced that Rock Hudson had died. And this one guy, total stranger to me, said to the rest of us in the room, "I think all those goddamn faggots should be lined up against a wall and shot."
Ugh, I know. It's hard to hear all of those in a row. But okay, so these experiences are all bad, but some are more nuanced than others. Like we can point to what happened to Bill and we can say, yeah, 100%, that's for sure wrong. Like harassment, bad. But for example, like Anne's story about the shower incident was a lot more nuanced and a lot more complicated for her to even think about. Like, should she have said something? Was she being oversensitive? If she brought this up to her supervisor, is there really anything her supervisor could have done? This man kind of came in and took her space, but it wasn't anything super blatant. And then, the same sort of situation for Madeline, where it's not really wrong to ask someone, per se about the relationship status, but it is like kind of disrespectful that was the first thing that was asked, by her supervisor, and they didn't even try to get to know her as a person. So many of the experiences that underrepresented communities in mining face are not just, they're not straight out blatant harassment because people know that will get them fired, but it's from microaggressions. And so microaggressions are, everyday subtle, intentional, but often unintentional interactions or behaviors that communicate some sort of bias towards historically marginalized groups. And so, Madeline being called Arctic Barbie or the Camp Prom Queen fit this because basically it's saying, you don't belong at camp, you belong in a beauty pageant. The man sitting outside of Anne's shower, there's been historical problems with men taking women's spaces, and that was what happened in that case. And I can list a few more microaggressions that like I've experienced or that my friends have experienced. For example, you don't look gay, insinuating all gay people look the same, displaying nude pinups at workplaces, which happened to almost everyone in the podcast I interviewed for episode 1, telling a person of color that they speak good English or that they're just a diversity hire. These are all things that when they're said to an underrepresented or marginalized person reinforce discriminatory ideas and behaviors. And I think it's really harmful to the industry because it's not blatant harassment or discrimination. So often the behavior does not get corrected, but these experiences add up over time. And if you're hearing these things over and over and over again, or experiencing them over and over, it, I think usually ends up in people really not like just leaving the industry entirely. So I think the question becomes, how do we change this behavior? And so my first thought about this is that if you're in a majority group within the geoscience, I think you have the most responsibility to make changes. And that's because you probably sit at the top level of an organization. The Osler's 2019 Diversity Disclosure Practices report said that only 13% of directors at mining companies in 2019 were women. So, if we want to create some change, especially from the top down, then that needs to come from our majority groups. The other thing is translating respect. So actually, Michelle, who was someone I interviewed in episode 1, I won't take credit for her idea, but she had a great idea for company-based workshops about respect that will encompass intersectionality and also all of the varied experiences that people have had. And it starts with this simple question, which is, what does a respectful workplace look like to you? And so people from every group can answer that. So, for myself, I could say, well, respect looks to me like people don't ask me about my husband, but instead they ask about a partner. Or a person with disabilities could say that respect to me in a workplace is having a ramp so I can get into the front door, or there's handicap accessible washrooms, that kind of thing. And everyone can give their interpretation of respect. And then you can go forward sharing that with the company and trying to basically create that mutual understanding so people will start changing their behaviors. I think, respect means something different to everyone because our life experiences vary so widely. And so this is a way to capture that knowledge so it can be implemented. On an individual level, I think there's a responsibility to talk about your own stories and translate your own lived experiences to other people when you can. I do believe stories are a very powerful way to connect to people, and people don't know what they don't know sometimes. Like, a lot of microaggressions are unintentional. And if you haven't grown up experiencing these things and being part of a historically marginalized group, you may not know the history there. So we need to share those stories and create that mutual understanding. Now, if you want to support underrepresented communities in geoscience, which I do hope everyone does, I don't think you need to have a big grand idea to actually create any change. I encourage you to think about your strengths. So, what are you comfortable in? What are you good at? For me, that was, podcasting, because I worked in communications already and it was something I wanted to do. But there's something you're good at, and you can try to leverage that to help turn the dial a little bit. So that's it for me today. I just want to say thank you so much to the organizers and sponsors of the conference for pulling this all together. I was really excited to see this happening. And the easiest way to get in touch with me, if you'd like to share any stories or just have any general commentary, is my email or my Twitter. Thanks, everyone.